On a trip through the recently conquered Inca Empire in the 1540s, conquistador and writer Pedro Cieza de Leon arrived at a place with strange ruins that piqued his interest. He knew from his experience in Peru that these were not Inca ruins, but something else. To quote his account,
"The greatest river in the region is called Biñaque, where there are some large and very ancient buildings, which, certainly because of their weathered and ruinous condition, must have lasted through many ages." Questioning the neighboring Indians as to who built that ancient place, they answered that it was other bearded white people like us, who a long time before the rule of the Incas are said to have come to this region and made their residence in it. And in regard to these and other ancient buildings in this realm, it seems to me that their plan is different from those structures which the Incas built or ordered built, for this building was square, and the Inca buildings are long and narrow. There is also a tale that writing was found on a stone slab of this building. In my opinion, people of great skill and reason are right here in ancient times, and they built these things and others that we do not see.
for Cieza de Leon, this must have been a profound moment of realization. In an instant, he would have understood that grand empires in the Andes were not a new Inca innovation, but part of a legacy that stretched back centuries. Unbeknownst to him, he had just stumbled upon the remains of Wari, the capital city of one of the largest empires in South America, which had long ago stretched from the jungles of the Amazon over the Andes to the shores of the Pacific. For almost 400 years, the Wari Empire was not only the dominant power of central and southern Peru, but an important template for a much more famous empire, the Inca Empire. You've probably heard of them. Today we are going to explore how the Wari Empire developed and operated and why it was so successful for so long. I hope you are all ready. In our last episode, we discussed Wari culture, and now that we have an appreciation for Wari creativity and ingenuity, we're going to take a look at the formation and rise of the Wari Empire. Wari sites are scattered across the Andes, far away from the Wari heartland in the Ayacucho Basin, which gives us a lot of excellent archaeological information about the Wari imperial presence throughout Peru. In fact, most of the artifacts that you saw in the previous episode came from many of these provincial sites. Now, in order to appreciate the span of the Wari Empire, we need to set the broader stage to appreciate the achievement of forging and maintaining such an empire, because the Andes are a landscape of opportunity and challenges. When you think of the Andes, you probably think of rugged mountain peaks and high plains, but there's actually an incredible amount of environmental diversity across the different vertical zones. If we take a cross-section of the Andes, we can appreciate this in more detail. Please note that many of these terms are in the Quechua language. There may be English equivalents for these, but my source had them in Quechua, so that's what I rolled with. Moving from left to right, or west to east in this case, we have coastal desert, or chalas, home to river valleys where fishermen brought in the bounty of the sea and farmers grew maize, squash, lucuma, and peanuts as well as cotton. Moving inland, the deserts give way to lower mountain valleys called yungas, which are great for growing tropical crops. Above the yungas are the Quechua, a mild area that allows the cultivation of many types of crops and vegetables. Above them are the Suni, a colder area that is well suited for tubers and quinoa. Higher still is the Puna, which is the highest zone that humans inhabit and is characterized by grasslands and rolling hills. Wild game and camelid pastoralism dominate the area. Beyond the peaks on the eastern side of the Andes, the zones give way to tropical rainforest, which connects the Andean world with the Amazon and its tropical goods, like tropical woods, feathers, and coca. Although incorporating these different areas was challenging and forced the Wari to take different approaches, it also provided them with access to a huge variety of goods and luxuries. Now, we are getting ahead of ourselves a bit, but I want to drive home how vast this empire was. At its maximum, the Wari Empire would have extended more than 1,300 kilometers, 800 miles, from its northern end to the south, and about 400 kilometers, 250 miles, at its widest point in the south. According to estimates, the empire could have included as much as 320,000 square kilometers or 125,000 square miles of territory. Yeah, it's not the British Empire or anything, but that's large enough to be the fifth largest U.S. state and the ninth largest country in Europe. This was an incredible achievement. But how did the empire get that big? Let's look at Wari Expansion. Just a recap from our last episode, the Wari emerged in the Ayacucho Basin near the modern-day city of Ayacucho around 600 CE, at the beginning of the period that archaeologists refer to as the Middle Horizon, which actually covers almost the entire Wari Empire's existence. The Wari capital, which is also called Wari, hence the name of the culture, began to expand into a huge city, and most of the population in the basin relocated there. This was happening in a time of turbulence across the Andes as a series of El Niños and droughts began to hit the region. The Wari were perfectly positioned to take advantage of the instability, and around 650 CE, they began to expand into neighboring areas. And we know this because this is also when Wari-style outposts, infrastructure, and artifacts started to appear outside the Ayacucho Basin, as if they were recreating their familiar world in new places. And these show up all over Peru. Let's focus on these outposts. Wari sites are easily identified by the distinct Wari architecture and planning. Contrary to what we saw at the Wari capital in the last episode, these sites are typically organized on a rigid grid, into which their walls, rectangular buildings, halls, and patios fit perfectly. Let's take a look at a good example, the excellently preserved site of Piquillacta in the Cuzco Valley. This site's grid plan is so well preserved that you could just load up Google Earth and see it for yourself. Just look at those neat and tidy rows on that immaculate grid. And if the ruins don't impress you, check out this recreation. Remember what we said about Wari architecture in the last video, because it still holds true here. Those buildings were often multiple stories high, plastered white, and roofed with thatch. Various rooms and patios were used for a variety of purposes, such as material and food storage and food preparation. These also would have been elite spaces for receiving dignitaries and hosting special events. I imagine that they must have dazzled visitors to the site. Tell me you wouldn't have visited this place 1,200 years ago, walked around, and not have thought, yeah, these people have things figured out. What's interesting about the architecture of this site is that while this would have been very visible at a distance, it would have felt very confined on the inside. Arriving there would have required you to walk through long, narrow avenues with walls that would have blocked any view of the surrounding landscape before you'd enter a building and arrive at a patio to meet your host. All your attention would have been focused on the Wari architecture, and it probably would have been overwhelming to a new visitor. Unlike the vast open plazas we've seen at sites like Chavin de Huantar and Tiwanaku, this is not a welcoming space for everyone. It was a statement of power. Now, to be fair, not every site looks exactly like this. They can range widely in size. Some of these settlements and outposts are massive, while others are only as large as a few buildings. The largest settlements, like Piquillacta, would have been administrative centers governing over valuable or strategic areas. Smaller sites may have served more specific functions, perhaps regulating and controlling movement or storing certain materials destined for the capital. Now, Wari Expansion was more than just building new settlements and outposts. They had to make sure that these were fed and watered, and luckily, the Wari knew just how to do it. As we mentioned in the previous episode, the Wari pioneered terraced agriculture, and this proved to be a very effective approach to highland agriculture. This is important, so we're going to go over it again real quick for the kids who were absent from class last episode. To terrace mountainsides, the Wari constructed an extensive network of sophisticated retaining walls with soil and fill designed to maximize drainage and to allow exhausted soil to be replaced. These terraces were fed by canals to keep the crops watered. They also prevented soil erosion and exhaustion and allowed for marginal slopes to become very productive agricultural zones. With terraces, farmers could grow up to 2 to 3 crops at lower elevations. With this approach, the Wari could create a much more stable food supply for their settlements. When the Wari arrived in a new area, they likely co-opted local labor to construct terraces across hillsides, and this would have had huge benefits for the locals who were able to farm on these terraces. Surplus food could be used to supply areas that were hit by a poor harvest, or be used to throw feasts for local nobles and communities. Now, Wari engineering wasn't limited to just terraces. These guys were not one-trick ponies. They also built very impressive canals and aqueducts across the empire to bring fresh water to communities. In the last episode, we saw a good example of such an aqueduct at Rubikolka near Pikiyakta. This aqueduct, along with a few other canals, filled 3 main reservoirs at Pikiyakta that could hold 225 to 230 cubic meters of water, roughly 60,000 gallons. That is impressive, and I'm sure the locals and visitors would have thought so too. For those who are wondering about why there are gaps in the aqueduct and the trademark Inca masonry, it's because the Inca later turned this impressive structure into a gate. However, to see the most impressive example of Wari hydraulic engineering, we need to go south to the Moquegua Valley. The valley is located in a very arid region, and so supplying water to settlements would have been an important priority. Now, I suppose you could be reasonable and just settle in the valley floor and use the river as your main water source, but Wari mamas didn't raise no Wari wimps, and so they decided to put their main settlements on the mountain summits and slopes. The main site in the valley, Cerro Baul, is located on a large mountaintop that dominates the area. Looking at this picture here, you can appreciate how high that mountain is and how arid and rugged the landscape is as well. While this was undoubtedly an imposing, defensible, and probably sacred site, it's also the last place you're going to find ample sources of water. So how did the Wari handle this challenge? To keep these settlements well watered, the Wari constructed a massive canal system 14 kilometers or 8.5 miles long that moved water across the Intermontane Divide from the Torata River all the way to these settlements. Doing so required clever routes across mountain slopes and large aqueducts over passes. And lest you think that this was some trickle, analysis has shown that the canal could discharge 400 liters of water per second. Not only did this supply drinking water, but it also provided water for terraced fields on the mountain slopes that could supply the community with food. That is A+ engineering right there. In fact, the scale of those Wari irrigation works in the Moquegua Valley would not be surpassed until modern-day irrigation projects were completed in the 20th century. Connecting these sites was a network of paved Wari roads that would have been instrumental in guiding officials, travelers, soldiers, and caravans of llamas to far-off destinations. These roads would foreshadow the later and more famous Inca road system. In fact, the Inca's road system would reuse many old Wari roads. This network of roads and outposts would have facilitated trade between different parts of the empire and brought exotic goods into the Wari capital, where they could have been transformed into finished luxury products. Shells from the coast, obsidian from foreign quarries, camelid wool, and bronze items would have been ferried to and from different areas. This infrastructure helps us see the Wari political system in action. Rule would have originated from the capital city out towards the administrative centers and towards smaller outposts. Although the Wari did not possess writing, they did have a system of maintaining records, the quipu, a system of knotted cords that could be used to store numerical information and more. If you want to know more about the fascinating history and mechanics of quipus, we got a whole episode on those that you can watch later, or now. Don't let me tell you what to do. That said, we can't say with any certainty how the empire was ruled. Was there an emperor like the Sapa Inca, or was the empire ruled by a governing body? During my research, I found almost no speculation on this question, but regardless of exactly who made decisions in the empire, they exercised authority over vast areas. Up to this point, I've presented the Wari as some imperious juggernaut stamping its print all over the empire, but it's time to add some nuance to this picture. The truth is that Wari influence was not uniform across the empire, and that some areas appear to have been rigidly controlled, while others show a much lighter touch. Some areas have almost no Wari infrastructure at all. So let's compare some different areas so that we can appreciate this, starting with the Wari Highlands. On one hand, this would have been an environment all too familiar to the Wari, but on the other hand, these areas would have posed logistical challenges, and I can't imagine that other Highland groups were thrilled when the Wari showed up on their doorstep selling imperial membership and the staff deity cult. I can imagine a few patriotic Scotsmen in the audience will sympathize. So it shouldn't be a surprise that we see some pretty tight control in these areas. The imposing size of Pikayakta would seem to indicate that this area required a bit of a heavy hand and direct Wari presence. We've also seen that the Wari invested heavily in building outposts in the Moquegua Valley in southern Peru. Recently, the Wari got a bit of a territorial boost when a new Wari site was discovered in the lowland jungles of the eastern Andes in 2010, very close to the more famous Inca site at Vilcabamba. This site, Espiritu Pampa, was an incredible discovery because not only was it in a region that was long believed to be untouched by the Wari expansion, but it also yielded intact elite tombs, and these have yielded incredible artifacts and knowledge about Wari imperialism and burial customs. This wasn't just a settlement that traded with the Wari, but one that was created by them with typical Wari architecture. That said, the site still shows an active and lively local Montaña culture, and their ceramics pop up in the archaeology, which is strong evidence for a lot of interaction with the Wari. That shouldn't be too surprising because, after all, this would have been a strategically important site that would have allowed the Wari to tap into the economically diverse region and their Amazonian trade networks. Let's contrast those areas by looking at the coastal and northern edges, starting with an area close to the Wari heartland, the Nazca region. Here, two Wari sites have been discovered, Huaca del Loro and the tiny site of Pataraya. Pataraya is merely a tiny way station near a small community. Huaca del Loro is more substantial, but still not particularly large. There was debate for decades about whether Huaca del Loro was a Wari or Nazca site, but recent excavations have confirmed that it was definitely a Wari site, complete with D-shaped temples and rectangular planning that was likely used to transport cotton from the coast to the highlands. This is an interesting site because there's evidence of both Wari elites and local Nazca people living side by side peacefully. This isn't too surprising when you think about it, because the Wari and their Warpa ancestors had very close relationships with the Nazca prior to the rise of the empire, and it makes a lot of sense that the Nazca would have been very close allies or dependable vassals. By and large, the local Nazca appear to have maintained their own political organization and were not reorganized or resettled by the Wari. Further up the coast in the region, around modern-day Lima, we see a similar trend. This area shows undisputed signs of Wari presence. Wari ceramics and artifacts and even elite Wari burials have turned up in the area. For a long time, it was thought that the Wari culture overtook the local culture, but recent work has shown that Wari ceramic styles overlap with evolving local styles that took a lot of inspiration from the Wari. One important local site that came under the Wari was the site of Pachacamac. This site has a long history before and after the Wari. During the contact period, Pachacamac was an important religious and oracle site, and it's likely that it was a similarly important place for the Wari to control. Under Wari rule, it prospered and grew, though whether this was the result of Wari or local efforts is still being debated. Pachacamac ceramics, in turn, influenced Wari pottery designs, and the Wari even adopted a new icon into some of their religious imagery, the Pachacamac griffin. What is clear is that during this time, economic differentiation between elites and commoners increased, and those elites adopted many new ideas from the Wari. The northern fringes of Peru present different patterns of Wari influence. The Cajamarca and Huamachuco areas show a clear Wari presence. The large Wari site of Viracocha Pampa lies in Huamachuco, and it displays all the hallmarks of Wari design: the grid, tall buildings, patios, etc. A lot of investment went into this settlement and outpost, but strangely, it was never finished and never integrated into the imperial road network for reasons that are not well understood. Another site all the way up in the Lambayeque region, Santa Rosa de Pucallá, has a D-shaped building with what appear to be 4 human sacrifices made by the Wari. It's still safe to say that these northern highlands were an important region to the Wari that merited some healthy investment. Now, this relationship wasn't one-sided. Local pottery styles from Cajamarca appear at the Wari capital, so many of them appear to have cozied up with the Wari elite really nicely. The northern highlands were probably strategically important, because they likely served as a jump-off point for the northern coast, and would have been instrumental in building and maintaining relationships with the coastal people there, the Moche. The Moche city-states had enjoyed prosperity and cultural florescence for centuries, and we've covered those centuries in one of my favorite episodes. But in the mid-7th century, it was beginning to unravel, and several cities were being abandoned. By 800 CE, Moche culture was all but finished. The Moche were a very martial group as well, and it's tempting for me to at least imagine Wari and Moche armies squaring off and fighting epic battles. That may have happened, I suppose, but there's not really any evidence of Wari aggression. There are no Wari settlements in the Moche valleys and no evidence of warfare. But there are lots of Wari artifacts. Up in the Heke de Peke Valley, excavations at the Moche sites of San Jose de Moro and Serchipen have revealed many Wari or Wari-inspired artifacts. Judging from their place in tombs, they were clearly prized, but these tend to be portable ceramic objects, lithics, or textiles in some cases, and none of these were produced locally. Rather, they were imported from the Wari state. Clearly, there was a healthy interaction between these Moche lords and the Wari, but teasing out the nature of this is difficult. Luis Jaime Castillo Butters argues very persuasively that these artifacts are not signs of Wari domination, but rather ideological imitation. As Moche culture faded, it's likely that local Moche lords in the valley were making efforts to associate themselves with the thriving Wari and their ideology. This is interesting because it shows that the Wari culture was not always something forced upon its subjects and allies, but rather something that was appealing and sought after. As a quick caveat, however, I will point out that other highland pottery styles appear in the Heke de Peke Valley at that time, so it wasn't only Wari influence that they were soaking up. Okay, with that all said, what does this all say about Wari imperialism and influence? Was the Wari state even an empire? That may sound like a bonkers question, but some scholars have argued that Wari presence represents an elite culture that was shared across a series of states or spheres of influence. The archaeologists who push for this tend to focus their attention on the northern highlands and coast, where Wari influence manifested very differently. I think it's fair to say, however, that the majority of scholars see the Wari as a centralized and expansive state. They note the incredible infrastructure, outposts, and building projects that the Wari constructed and maintained, particularly in the highlands. To do this, they would have had to exercise authority over many different people and cultures, speaking many different languages to coordinate state building projects and facilitate further expansion. But even if you agree that this is an empire, why is Wari imperialism so patchy and inconsistent? Some of you might interpret this as a sign of Wari weakness, an inability to impose tight control over a vast area. However, many other scholars see this as a very pragmatic approach, and I'm inclined to agree with them. Some areas did indeed require a very active Wari presence, while other areas with more amenable populations didn't. In areas where existing infrastructure could easily be co-opted, the Wari likely made use of what was already there. It's also worth pointing out that even in areas that did have a strong Wari presence, that the local populations and cultures didn't just disappear. They continued to exist, presumably with some extra Wari oversight. Katarina Schreiber coined this approach the mosaic of control, and I've seen it quoted in multiple books. She describes the notion thus.
We can think of an empire as a mosaic, with different territories needing different levels of control, striking a balance between the needs of the empire and the pre-existing cultural situation in each region.
I really like this idea. Keep in mind, the idea of an empire in Peru was novel at that time. There was no previous empire that the Wari could draw lessons from, and I imagine that they built theirs on the fly and that they must have tried different approaches to different areas. Some populations may have welcomed the stability that the Wari brought, while others may have been resentful. If there's one lesson from history we can appreciate, it's that empires always have their fans and their critics. But how did the Wari keep their subjects satisfied and their critics at bay? Besides ensuring plentiful food supplies and a peaceful order, the Wari had other ways to win over local leaders. One method that we can see in the archaeological record is feasting. I hope you're ready to learn more than you ever wanted about Wari parties because we are diving right in. Quick clarification, when I use the term feasting, I'm not just referring to someone chowing down on a bunch of food, but rather a party or celebration. Feasting is something that we can all relate to because this is something that all humans participate in, whether we celebrate a birthday, our national holiday, or a religious holiday like Christmas or Eid al-Fitr. People love a good party, and not just for the food. In all societies, these can represent special opportunities that allow people to build new relationships and affirm old ones. Such gatherings allow people to make friends, exchange news, discuss politics, and other social interactions. In the Wari Empire, feasting had important roles in building networks of obligation and reciprocity. How do we know this? First, we know from later accounts about the Inca that feasting was crucial in the running of the empire. Feasting cemented patron-client relationships between the elite and commoners. Thus, when a noble needed a lot of labor for some building project, he'd be expected to provide those under him with ample food and drink in exchange for their services. Nobody quits their job when the company holiday kegger is right around the corner, am I right? We also know that the Inca sealed agreements with foreign leaders through lavish feasting and gifting. One important element of the ceremony was to toast chicha in matching drinking cups called caros. Cheers! Although we can't say this for sure, it's likely that such rituals and ceremonies were built upon long-standing Andean traditions that the Wari employed. That said, we don't need to take the Inca's words for it. Archaeologists have actually found feasting spaces and the debris and waste left over from Wari feasts. One of the best sites to see this is the site of Contrapada. At this site, large urns were set into the floor that were used to serve large quantities of chicha, or maize beer. Shattered vessels and cups from the site have tested positive for chicha residue, so it would suggest that people were participating in a ceremony where chicha was served abundantly and the vessels smashed at the end. Interestingly, studies from the site of Quilcapampa have shown that this may not have always been just ordinary chicha in these vessels. Chicha residue tested from these ceramics showed other ingredients such as moye fruit and vilca seeds. Vilca seeds have psychotropic properties, so I think it's safe to say that the people drinking that chicha would have had a memorable night hearing all the colors of the rainbow and getting lost in the sauce. Another instance of feasting can be seen at the smaller site of Morduchiok, where patios next to elite residences showed debris made up from the remains of feasts. It's likely that the Wari people living and working here were probably hosting local guests as part of their duties. Excavation at these and other sites show the remains of chicha, camelid bones, and other food remains from potatoes, maize, quinoa, beans, and squash. They were eaten real good. The shattered cups and dishes from these occasions at elite locations show that no expense was spared. The wealthiest Wari patrons and lords had beautifully decorated wares, many of which we saw in the last episode. Pouring chicha out of vessels with the staff deity or from a face neck jar probably had rich symbolism. Making these vessels that would only be used once, preparing chicha, gathering the food, and rounding up the guests would have required enormous investment in time and labor. Indeed, I think it's safe to say that there was an entire economy around feasting. These elite occasions would have required a lot of planning, but this was worth it because it allowed them to exchange gifts and build important relationships between the governors and the governed, or between close allies. On a related note, the Wari also brought a powerful new ideology to bear, the staff deity complex. We discussed this in detail in the last episode, so I won't go into the weeds on this, but it's worth noting that this imagery is central to a lot of elite Wari art. The cult of the staff deity would have legitimized Wari power and authority by blending natural elements with supernatural concepts. Elite vessels showcase the staff deity and his minions front and center, and as we saw in the Moche area earlier, this ideology had a lot of appeal to many foreigners. That sounds pretty cool, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this expansion was not always, perhaps seldom, peaceful, and that this came at a violent price. In fact, the Wari could be downright brutal to their foes. I apologize in advance, but this will contain some pretty gruesome details. If you're sensitive to discussions of violence, you can skip ahead to the time marker below. As mentioned in the previous episode, Wari art does depict and glorify warriors and violence. We actually have some detailed depictions of warriors in the form of miniature figurines recovered from Pikayakta. These warriors brandish maces, atlatls, and shields, and several have aggressive postures. Besides warriors, we can also find images and depictions of captives that have been tied and bound. And speaking of captives, a common motif in Wari art are trophy heads. Now, the Wari were not the first Andean people to partake in head hunting. Those who have seen our Nazca and Moche episodes will know that severed heads pop up in the archaeology and art over there, and the Wari appear to have continued this trend. Heads have been found in archaeology, but there are also pots explicitly modeled off of trophy heads or skulls. Analysis on recovered trophy heads from Wari sites show that they were not local, and that they had been captured in raids or wars in foreign lands. It's likely that such captives were brought back to Wari sites and ritually sacrificed before their remains were processed and their decapitated heads were made into trophies. Most trophy heads were taken from men, but there are examples of children being used for this as well. These trophies would have been important status symbols for their owners that testified to their martial prowess and success. While war could certainly produce results in the form of new territories, resources, and captives, it's worth remembering that this was no guarantee of peace, and that Wari presence may not have always curbed violence. For example, in the Majes Valley to the south of the Wari heartland, studies on human remains have shown that a third of adult men and women from the Middle Horizon exhibited cranial trauma, a startling figure. We have no way to know for certain who inflicted these injuries. The Majes Valley is located between the highlands and the Moquegua Valley, and thus it was a strategic area that the Wari would have been motivated to keep a tight grip on. While it's certainly possible that these are scars from Wari soldiers, it's equally possible that this was local violence made possible by the Wari intrusion. Now, this is only one region in the empire, and I wasn't able to find any comparative studies, so for all I know, this could be an isolated case. Regardless, it's very striking that the Wari presence in the Majes Valley didn't result in a Pax Wari. Speaking of foreign relationships, there's a big elephant in the room that we need to address, and that is Tiwanaku. The Wari were not the only large expansive state in the Andes at this time. On the southern shores of Lake Titicaca in modern Bolivia, the city of Tiwanaku rose to significance during the 4th century, although its origins go back a few centuries earlier. It became an extremely important cultural center in the southern Andes, and eventually became an expansive state in its own right. There's some debate about whether Tiwanaku was the first empire in South America. Its leaders were certainly ambitious, but there's generally much more consensus that the Wari were an empire. If that sounds interesting to you, we got 2 whole episodes on Tiwanaku if you want to learn more about this fascinating site and culture. Interestingly, the Wari and Tiwanaku states overlapped at one area, the Moquegua Valley. While the Wari built Cerro Baul and Cerro Maya up on the slopes, Tiwanakan groups settled in the valley floor. This might seem ripe for conflict, but interestingly, there's no sign of that. If Wari and Tiwanaku ever did come to blows, there's no current evidence in the archaeological record. Tensions may have been high, but it doesn't seem to have resulted in violence. In fact, it's worth pointing out that for all their differences, Tiwanaku and Wari did have similarities. They both participated in the staff deity complex, so there was some shared ideology, and you can see this in a lot of Tiwanaku art and architecture. They also made similar artifacts, like those flared carrows that we mentioned earlier. Other similarities can be seen in mortuary traditions as well. Both cultures appear to have adopted these religious and cultural traditions from a common source, and based on this, I'd venture a guess that the Wari didn't look at Tiwanaku as uncouth barbarians, but as refined peers to be taken seriously. Unfortunately, no state lasts forever, and the Wari would eventually see a precipitous decline in the 10th century. The collapse of the Wari Empire remains poorly understood. What we know is that provincial centers were slowly abandoned, and that it wasn't a sudden process. Many sites were retired slowly. A good example can be seen at the site of Hincamoco. At this site, patios and galleries were slowly filled with trash and refuse. Doorways and corridors were sealed up to close off certain areas of the site. Similar patterns can be seen at Piquillacta. At the site of Pataraya, the Wari buildings were ceremoniously closed, and a thin layer of river sand was spread on the floors of the buildings. It suggests that the Wari Empire ran out of steam and slowly retreated back to the heartland and closed up shop. The Wari Empire may have been built on continual expansion, and a slowdown or cessation of expansion may have put the empire and its subjects under stress, but that's just speculation. Foreign invasion is possible, but also unlikely since there weren't any other Andean groups that could have posed a threat. For those in the back who want to yell out Tiwanaku, they were in the process of collapsing as well, so they weren't in a position to challenge the Wari. Tiwanaku, as it turns out, was getting pushed to the brink by a drought that catastrophically lowered the lake levels at Lake Titicaca. Although terraces were much better suited to dealing with droughts than the irrigation methods used by Tiwanaku, this may have also been a factor in the Wari decline. Rebellious subjects, disease, and crop failure have all been offered up as explanations. The aftermath of the collapse was not pretty. The Wari had provided the Andean world with a lot of stability, and in the power vacuum that followed, violence flared up in many areas and escalated, which caused a lot of populations to migrate to new areas. Even in the Wari heartland, there's a pretty dramatic increase in violence from Wari to post-Wari times. Despite the degrading political conditions, the Wari appear to have stayed put in the Ayacucho Basin, and genetic studies have shown that there was no population replacement or turnover after the fall of the empire. They kept chugging, just not as imperial lords. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering how the Wari Empire influenced or inspired the Inca Empire. When it came to infrastructure, the Inca appear to have borrowed many elements of the Wari Empire, such as road systems, gridded city plans, niched halls, and quipus. We know that the Wari were very active in the Cuzco Valley, and the ancestors of the Inca must have seen Wari infrastructure all around them. In many ways, the Wari Empire can be seen as something of a dress rehearsal for the Inca, but it's worth noting that there are differences. For example, the Inca never built D-shaped structures like the Wari. The Wari's artistic legacy on the Inca is a bit less pronounced. While Wari art is full of clear religious imagery, explicit representations of deities are almost completely absent in Inca art. While the Inca did make fine tapestry tunics, they were not charged with the same kind of religious imagery. How aware the Inca were of the Wari is hard to say, but there are some tantalizing clues in Inca historical traditions that the Inca remembered the Wari before them. In one recorded Inca legend about the Wari site of Hincamoco, they claimed that the site was built by strangers that they called Viracochas. Viracocha happens to be the name that the Inca gave to their creator deity, who brought civilization to the earth. Could this be a reference to the Wari, or simply to people from a foreign land? Maybe, possibly, but we can't answer that with any certainty. Another interesting example comes from the famous late Peruvian ethnohistorian Maria Rostrowski. She suggested that the name of the first Inca emperor, Pachacuti, was actually a Wari name that he adopted after he was crowned the Sapa Inca. There's no consensus on this, and it could be a local Quechua name, but that'd be really cool if it were true. Jua Hiltunen argues that one Spanish chronicler, Fernando de Montesinos, provides a list of royal dynasties that supposedly bridge the gap between the last Wari kings and the later Sapa Incas, but most scholars are very hesitant about this interpretation. Now, it's worth noting, however, that according to chronicler Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, the Inca royal family traced their origins to Manco Capac and Mama Ocllo, who were sent to the earth by the sun god and emerged from Lake Titicaca. In my humble opinion, this suggests that the Inca were willing to draw legitimacy from wherever they could, Wari or Tiwanaku. My opinions aside, the Wari Empire was a grand achievement. It was Peru's first empire, possibly South America's first, but there's a little debate on that. Wari culture represented a fluorescence of highland culture that would merit attention on that alone, but it was also so successful that it spread all over the Andean world. They created a system that would be emulated by later empires, most famously by the Inca. To realize their ambitions, they recreated the Andes in their image by building vast networks of roads, terraces, and outposts. Wari art shows us the fruits of these ambitions in intricate tunics and beautiful pottery decorated with the glory of the staff deity. Managing so many people under one yoke forced the Wari to adopt many different approaches to different people, and it paid off. The empire lasted for over 3 centuries. I hope in the course of these 2 videos you've come to appreciate the incredible legacy of the Wari. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode. Once again, special thanks to my patrons for supporting my work and for selecting this topic. You guys are the best. If you'd like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Facebook. We'll see you in our next episode. Take care.